May I have your attention, please? Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
My name is future priest Ethan Hawkins, and I'd like to serve you forever as priest on very soon. It's now time to start buying your seats for Sabbath services. May I have your attention, please? Shabbat Shalom, everyone. My name is future priest Ethan Hawkins, and I want to serve you forever as a priest on you very soon. It's my great privilege and honor to present to you the future priests and priestesses now in the sanctuary. It's a great honor and privilege to present to you our first speaker, future priest Nebiah Hawkins.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. May the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you. You may be seated. Today I'm going to be talking about obedience. If you can turn over in the book of Yahweh to Exodus 19, verse 5. Exodus 19, verse 5 is on page 60. And it says, "Now therefore, if you will truly obey my voice by keeping my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine." In the second book of Israel, going on to perfection, chapter 29, the keys to the kingdom, number 1, on page 266, pastor says, "If you will truly obey my voice, if you will truly obey, not if you disobey, not if you hang on to this anger, not if you keep this dirt on your face that the law is showing you." This means studying the law. It means consulting with the priest to get full understanding of the law. If you can turn over to Ephesians. Ephesians 6, 1 through 3, and verse 5. And it says, "Children, obey your parents in Yahweh, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may be well with you, and you may live long on the earth." And verse 5 says, "Servants, be obedient to those who are your rulers, according to the flesh, with fear, trembling, and in sincerity of heart, as to the Messiah." Now if you can turn over to Colossians, just a few pages over, Colossians 3, verse 20 and 22. Colossians 3, 20 and 22. And it says, "Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to Yahweh. Fathers, verse 22. Servants, obey in all things your rulers according to the flesh, not as men pleasers, when their eyes are upon you, but sincerity of heart, reverencing Yahweh." So you can see that children need to obey the authority, need to obey their parents and authorities, and the adults need to obey the authorities such as the Kohans and pastor. If you can turn over to Hebrews. Hebrews 13, verse 17 is on page 9:52. It says, "Obey those who have rule over you and submit yourself, for they watch out for your souls. As they who give account, do your part, that they may do so with joy, not with grief, for it is unprofitable for you." If you can also turn over to Deuteronomy. You can also turn over to Deuteronomy 28. Deuteronomy 28, verse 1 and 2. It says, "And it will be if you listen diligently to the voice of Yahweh your Father, by observing and doing all his laws which I command you this day, that Yahweh your Father will set you high above all nations on the earth as his kings and priests. And all these blessings will come upon you and accompany you, because you obey Yahweh your Father." You belong to Satan if you disobey Yahweh's laws. And with the world's holiday season approaching, we must be extra careful to obey Jeremiah 10, 1 through 4. Let's turn, if you can turn to Jeremiah 10, 1 through 4. Jeremiah 10, 1 through 4 is on page 581. It says, Hear the word which Yahweh speaks concerning you, O house of Yisrayl. This is what Yahweh says: Do not learn the religious practices of the heathen, Gentile nations, and do not be deceived by the signs of heaven. Though the heathen are deceived by them. With them they set their feasts. For the religious customs of the people are vain, worthless. For one cuts a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workmen with an axe. They decorate it with gold and silver, fasten it with nails and hammers so it will not tumble over. Don't let unconverted can cause you to disobey. Be obedient, keep the Sabbath, keep the feast, because you are a servant to whom you obey. So in conclusion, I'd like to remind you that obedience is the key to be a part of Yahweh's royal family.
Brethren, it's a great privilege and honor to present to you this morning a future priest, the great Deacon Tawakia Hawkins.
Praise Yahweh. You may be seated. May the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you. Now today I'm going to be talking about coming to the feast and how easy we have it to come to the feast. As you know, the feast is approaching very fast. It's within a week away. So if everyone can turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 16. And this is on page 161. And look at verse 16. It says, 3 times a year all your males shall appear in front of Yahweh your Father at the place he will choose, at the feast of unleavened bread, at the feast of weeks, and at the feast of tabernacles. And they must not appear in front of Yahweh empty-handed. So no matter what, you have to make it to those 3 feasts, if it's at all possible. So, because that's a commandment from Yahweh. So, you remember, Pastor, whenever he traveled, or whenever his family traveled from Graham, Texas, it took them 28 days to get where they were going. And that was with giving the mule or the animals the rest and things like that. Well, pushing the animals, the horses and mules and things like animals like that, they could get 15 to 25 miles in one day, pulling a wagon with all the people and the luggage. So, and that would, but oxen, they could get around 10 to 12 miles a day. So you can see how long it would have taken to get to the feast. Just imagine if you lived around 280 miles away from here. You would have had to start coming to the feast last month on the 11th, September 11th, if you want to get here in time. And that's with the day to spare. So there's not much time. So you can see how much planning they had to do. Whereas today, we can get here in just over 4 hours if we live 280 miles away. So I have some articles about the covered wagon. As you all know from the exhibits during the feast, you know what a covered wagon looks like. And a covered wagon, it says, also known as a prairie schooner, has been a cultural icon of the American Old West. Although covered wagons were commonly used for transporting things within the United States in the mid-19th century, thousands of Americans took them across the Great Plains from developed parts of the Midwest to places in the West, such as California, Oregon, Colorado, and Montana. So you can see this took a long time to get from place to place. And that's with a covered wagon. Now walking, on the other hand, you average walking 3 miles an hour on flat, easy ground, not much rough terrain. And you could average around 40 miles in a 12-hour day. Well, just to get 41 miles, that would take you a little bit over a day. And if you wanted to go over 200 miles, that would take 5 days. So even walking, it takes a while. So we have it so easy with the increase of knowledge, as it says in Daniel. We have it so easy to do these things in these last days. But always remember that these people, back in Yahshua's day, back in the times of old, they had to make it to these feasts. There was no ifs, ands, or buts, because that was a prophecy from Yahweh. If you can turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 12. Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse 5. It says, it's on page 157, "But you are to seek the habitation of your father, the house of Yahweh, the place which Yahweh your father shall choose out of all your tribes to establish his name, and there you must go." So there's the commandment again. So that it's twice there in the book of Yahweh. We have to do this. And these people, they prepared in advance, months in advance, because if you didn't, you wouldn't make it there on time. They had to prepare in order to make it to Yahweh's house. So keep that in mind as we're drawing near to this feast. And keep in mind the people that back in the days of old, they didn't have the luxury of being able to be places and that are over 200 miles away in under 4 hours. So that we have this blessing of this the increase of knowledge. Now, to get 190 miles, it would take you from 13 to 19 days. To get 200 miles, it would take 14 to 20 days, and this is with a horse and wagon. To get 41 miles, it would take you over 2.5 days to 4 days. So it took a long time to do this. And keep that in mind, because the feast is drawing near, and we need to start preparing for this feast. We have less than a week away. Less than a week away. We should have started preparing months ago. As soon as the Feast of Pentecost and Feast of Passover ended, we should start preparing for the next feast, setting our minds in advance to become like Yahweh, become like gold, because that's what we're striving to do in these last days. So I encourage everyone to put forth your full effort to do and to become like gold, and set your mind on Yahweh. And if there's anything that tries to get in between you setting your mind on Yahweh and becoming like gold, don't allow it to get there. You have to become like Yahweh if we're going to make it into this priesthood. So I'd like to, if you all please stand, have the great honor and privilege to turn it over to the great Kahan Kiefer Hawkins.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Praise Yahweh. You may be seated, and may the peace of Yahweh truly be with each and every one of you. It's It's truly a great honor to be able to be, in Yahweh's house in these last days, and to have the opportunity to help prepare in this time period we're in. Oh, I can't find my notes in that book. Oh, let me get my purple one. Yes, look at that. I'll get my brand new purple book of Yahweh. Yes, here we are. I hope your love for the house of Yahweh is growing every day, because like I said, these are truly exciting times that we're in, and we've got a lot of work to do. But in order for us to do this work, we have to reach a certain point. And the title of my sermon today that I'd like to speak on is, "Are we getting ready to make atonement?" And we always keep these things in mind before the Day of Atonement, and as it approaches. What our mindset and the purpose at which we were created. We have to keep those things in mind. If you turn over to Colossians 3, it's found on page 927. If you don't have a purple book, I think it's still on page 927. But I encourage everyone to get, isn't that cool? That's the coolest color. Page 927, and let's look at Colossians 3 and verse 14. Where it says, "And above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection." The bond of perfection. If you've seen that in a King James Version, it says, "Above all these things, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity." And I'm not going to say, which one's right, because to me that they say the same thing. Because the bond of perfection, coming into perfect unity with Yahweh, that's the perfection that we're seeking. There's many key words in this scripture that I'd like to just take a minute to focus on, but one of which is the rank and priority in which it's talking about, because it says above all things we need to put on this love. So we see this is the greatest priority that we need to be focused on at this time and forever is to put on this love. Now, to put on, if you look at the word put, it actually means to bring into a particular state or condition. That this is something that we have to do ourselves. It's not just going to be done to us. We don't come somewhere and get changed without our putting forth the effort. We have to put on this love in order to bring about this bond of perfection. And of course, love, as we know, is the keeping of Yahweh's law, which brings us into unity with Him and His house, and that is this body that we're being fitly joined together into. But I have to mention the word bond, because as a builder, you see certain things in words that a bond. The strength of a bond it determines the strength of the entire structure. You can have quality materials and such, but when you go to build it and put it together, it's a bond that holds everything together. And as a force, if you're talking about a building, as a wind or rain or flood or whatever would come against this building, it's the bond of each joint that holds that building together. And that load transfers to the foundation, which is in building, they call that a continuous load path, where a load is put against a building, but every single member being fitly joined together holds that force and transfers that load to the foundation. And brethren, that is what we are becoming here in the house of Yahweh. So we have to be on guard of things that would separate us, because I know as time draws closer, it seems like the tests get a little bit stronger upon us. But there's great encouragement, because I've seen this here recently, tests coming upon people, and I've seen different reactions that I would have seen years ago. And that gives me the encouragement and the hope and the understanding of knowing that we are reaching this point we're coming to the point where we are in unity with Yahweh. And we'll get that. I'm kind of jumping a little bit ahead of myself. But Luke 6, let's turn over to Luke 6. That is found on page 788. Luke 6. And if you look at 47, because this is how this is done. What I just spoke about, this is how our high priest tells us to attain it. He says, whoever comes to me and hears my sayings and then does them, I will show you what that man is like. He is like a man who built a house, and digging deep, he set the foundation on a rock. And when the flood rose, when the waves beat forcefully against the house, they could not shake it, for it was founded upon a rock. Well, this rock, this Yahweh unity that the house of Yahweh is established on, is a firm foundation that cannot be shaken. It's impossible to move this foundation. And as we grow into unity with it, we become joined to it to where this house will never be shaken. The gates of hell will never prevail against the work of Yahweh. And that is encouraging to know, because we actually see it being fulfilled, right before our very eyes. It's incredible. But this creates an unbreakable bond. Now, if you remember in Psalms 119, and specifically in 165, he says, great peace have those who love your law, and nothing is going to offend them. So that is that unbreakable bond that we have to attain, is that love for Yahweh's law that is going to keep us from ever breaking a bond. Because when troubles arise between individuals, it's that love for Yahweh's law that settles the issue. And we'll get to that in depth here in a little bit. But let's go ahead and turn to Ephesians 4. That's found on page 918. Ephesians 4. And let's look at verse 2. Where he says, with all lowliness and meekness, with long-suffering, patience, bearing with one another in love, endeavoring with the utmost of diligence and zeal to keep the unity of the Spirit. No, this is not a gas. Well, to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. That this has to be something that we put our utmost diligence and zeal into. And when we do so, we create this strong bond. Right? When our desire to keep Yahweh's law is greater than our desire to get our own way, okay? When we do, as the scripture says in Deuteronomy 17, and we come to the priest and we get our instructions here at the house of Yahweh, and we do, as Deuteronomy says, we don't go to the right or the left from those instructions. When we submit to those instructions, we grow into unity. Because where is the conflict? Where then is the conflict? If we both agree on the answer, there can be no conflict, right? But we have to put our own selfish ways aside in order to attain that. And this is very, very serious, brethren. I want everybody to really be focusing on this as the time draws near, because this is our strength. This is the thing that will not allow us to be moved away from this house. And I know many people, like I said, have been tested, and emotions run high, and our angers flare up, and we have a desire to hold on to that anger. But I've also seen great examples here in the last few weeks where people have put those things aside and determined in their mind, no one's going to take my crown. I'm going to continue to submit to Yahweh's law, and even if it's painful, even if it's very uncomfortable for me to make peace with a brother after we've been at odds with each other, I've got to be determined to do it. And by doing so, we're qualifying for this great position. And I like I said, I've seen specific examples over the last couple of weeks. One of them, I was almost brought to tears. I've seen a young man who seemed to always have problems with another young man that, they couldn't be together. And, I try to tell them, we can't be like this, and I saw an instance where something took place, and normally he would have flare up his temper and yelled, and I saw him just like kind of, grit his teeth and grab his hands, and he looked at me, he says, "I'm trying, Great Khan, I'm trying." And I said, "You know what? I see that you're trying." I see it. And I know if I see it, I know Yahweh sees it. And Yahweh sees us all trying. He sees us all striving to keep His laws. And that is what we have to be remembering. Because when we look at each other, we're looking at the kingdom of Yahweh. We have to always be able to recognize that. Sometimes our emotions will allow us to get blinded, and we get so caught up in proving, well, I was in the right. I was in the right. It doesn't really matter, These little things that we fight over sometimes, that they're so insignificant when you're able to step back and look at the big picture. And that big picture is that we are coming into unity, okay? And nothing is going to stop us from coming into unity, the ones that will. We have that promise. So, if you'll stop to think where we are in prophecy and realize that the time period that we're in prophecy right now, this is the most noteworthy time period in the history of mankind, ever. Okay? And we're here right in it at the location that is going to bring about an everlasting peace. That's going to put a stop to all this hatred and misery that we've seen in the world. Brethren, we're at a very unique period in time and history. And if we keep that in the forefronts of our mind, like I said, we won't get tore away with all these little disputes, Because you can look at it like that, or you could say, well, no, I'd rather hold on to my grudge. My grudge is very important to me. It's more important than rescuing mankind from the evil that they're bringing. No, my grudge is more important. Or maybe it's the gods of Hollywood. Yes, no, I can't be bothered with the work of Yahweh because I have to be paying attention to the gods of Hollywood. Well, do you not know that there will be no gods in this kingdom? And if it's not forever, we don't want it, get rid of it. There's nothing on that stupid television that is going to bring you life eternal. There's nothing in that worldly music that is going to help you with the work that Yahweh called you here to train for. And this is the work that Yahweh called you here to train for. Not to have one foot in the world and one foot in the house. And brethren, we have got to set an example with our young men, with our children. When we're sitting at a table and conversations start getting on worldly things, or conversations start getting in places where they shouldn't be, what in the world are we teaching the children? We have to lead by example. And I know some of these children, they're at the point where they'll point it out to us, I have so much hope, when I see how righteous the children in the house of Yahweh are. It gives me the hope to know that this is taking place. But we're going to see some more hope here, carrying on in the sermon. We have to use this time to prepare to teach the nations to come into the house of Yahweh. This time period that we're in right now, we have to use it in order to do this. We have to be determined that anything that takes place to help our brothers and sisters make it into this kingdom also. That has to be our priority. So that brother who offended you, you need to make sure that you do whatever it is, me too, all of us, that we do whatever it is to help that individual make it into that kingdom. Because this is the will of Yahweh, that none should perish. And if we're going to become children of our Father, we have to take on that same characteristic, that same love for one another. We can't allow whatever these bickerings between each other get in between the preparation and the work that we've been called to do, because this is the will of Yahweh and this is the work of Yahweh that we were called to do at this time. If you look at Philippians real quick here, Philippians 2. I'll get you a page number in a second. Philippians 2, found on page 922. And look at verse 2, where he says, "Complete my joy by being like-minded, and having the same love, being united in one accord of mind, and let nothing be done by way of strife or empty glory, but in lowliness of mind let each other esteem each other better than themselves. Let every one of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others." Okay, and then this is the big part. Look at verse 5. "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Yeshua Messiah." We have to come to the same mindset that was in Yeshua Messiah. Because Yeshua Messiah is in perfect unity with Yahweh. And that's what he said. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Not that they were some kind of Trinity. Don't get all confused, Christianity. No, they weren't all the same person. But what he's saying, he was in complete unity with Yahweh. Now, our high priest has sent us a Malach in these last days to gather the remnant together and to teach us how to become in perfect unity with Yahweh. All right? And that's truly awesome. Yahweh cares about us that much that he gave us a very determined individual that is not willing that any of us should fall or perish, that he has the character of Yahweh himself, and he's here to guide and teach us. We are absolute fools if we don't take advantage of that, because that's the purpose. And we have to become like him, and we have to become teachers just like he is. But remember all this, because I want to share with you something. Something that took place months ago, and I'll just get into it. But as I was driving, I was coming from a job in Baird heading towards Clyde, and I was driving on Interstate 20 and coming from the north to the south, there was a cloud that was moving real quick. I was driving, it caught my eye because all the rest of the clouds seemed to be somewhat stationary, and it was moving pretty quick and across the road there, and I looked at it, and it had the silhouette or the outline of, when we come up for Passover, or the feast, the priests that come up on stage. It looked like a bunch of priests marching, across the road. And I thought, well, that's pretty neat. And I looked just closely at the front of the line, and I saw something very interesting. Because there was a definite leader in the front, okay? And right behind him, right to his side, to his left, was our overseer. And you could tell that outline. Pastor is a very, very specific, we see him all the time. It was very easy for me to pick up who that was. But what's also important to note, there was a lot of clouds behind him. Like, I couldn't tell you a number. It just went on. Okay? Now this gets more. I wrote it down in this book that day. Because I wanted to take note of the time that it took place and the date and all that. So I wrote it down when I come to a stop in my notebook, and I put it in the back of my truck, and I said, I got to turn this in, when Sabbath comes. And then when Sabbath came, I got caught up with doing the work of Yahweh, and I kind of forgot about it. And I said, well, next Sabbath, and then next Sabbath, and next Sabbath. And next thing you know, it was on the bottom of all the stuff that gets jumbled around in my truck from week to week. Anyway, I wrote all this down, and I wrote this description down and everything that took place that day. So, here recently when the great Kohan, he showed us that picture from NASA with the rainbow, the one on the beach. And, I was in awe at all the things in that picture. It was such an awesome presentation what Yahweh's done. I'd hurt my foot really bad, and I'd gone home after services, and I was, wanted to get off my feet, and I was laying down, and he had mentioned the date of that picture in the sermon, but I didn't really pick up on it. But my wife was actually looking up the word in Strong's as I was laying down, and she started reading she said, this is really interesting. She said she started reading the meaning, and as soon as she did, it's like I got goosebumps on my spine because I recognized that word. And I went back to my truck and jumbled through all my stuff, and I found my notebook, and yes, it was the same date that I saw was the same date that picture was taken. Now, praise Yahweh. Now it was taken on 6/17. 6/17. Now, I saw this at 6/17 at 5:45 p.m. At 6:17, if you look up that word in Strong's, it's from 6:31, and it means to fasten, to join, to bind, to harness, to make ready. So where do you think we are right now in prophecy? It gets better. It means to prepare. It also means to set in array. Now that word array, if you ever look up that word array, you'll see a few different meanings, but array is a systematic arrangement of objects, usually in rows or columns, kind of like a rainbow, to clothe with garments, especially of an ornamental kind. That's what array means, and that's what that word meant. Also at 5:45, if you look up the word 5:45, it means in the sense of training, being brought up. Okay? If you think that Yahweh doesn't have a hand in what's going on right now, you are so far removed from reality, I don't know how to reach you. Let's turn over to Hebrews 12 real quick. Because these are, you can't even keep up with the miraculous things that are done right now. But remember all those definitions. Remember that the time period that we're in, remember that we're preparing. We're preparing for work. We're preparing for position. And we're right about there. Okay, look at Hebrews 12 and verse 1. He said, "Therefore, since we are also surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily entraps us, and let us run the race that is set before us with endurance." You know what it means to have endurance? Endurance comes when tests and trials come upon you, but you're determined to stay focused and stay on the path. Yeah, my foot hurts, but I got to go to work today. So I'll limp around work, but I'm determined to do it. Setbacks that always come about us. These things that make us really upset. And you think, well, I'm not going to, I'm going to quit. No, quitting doesn't have anything to do with endurance. Endurance is keeping that focus in front of you, not getting sidetracked with all the terrible things that take place, and looking forward to what Yahweh has prepared for us. Okay, that's how you attain this endurance. But he said, let us run the race that is set before us with endurance. Notice verse 2. Looking to Yahshua, the first who was led and perfected by the faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the sacrifice. Okay, that's the mindset that we read about earlier. Let this mind be in you. Yes, let this mind be in you. Let it be in me. Let it be in all of us together. And let us put aside our petty differences and learn to work with one another in complete unity to get this work done. Because that's the most important thing in the world right now, is getting this work done. And someday we'll look back at it, and future generations will ask, what was it like during that time? and we could sit them down and we can explain all these things, or we could say, well, I was holding on to a grudge at that time, so I didn't really feel it was necessary for me to get involved. There was this really cool show on TV during the time that we were called to work. No, it all seems rather silly when you put it in perspective. But what Satan wants to do is take it out of perspective. She wants you to get sidetracked with all these things. She wants you to find any reason to stop paying attention to this goal. But brethren, in the house of Yahweh, let us keep our goal right there in our forefront of our mind, so that we'll know what direction we're going. Because Yahweh, who promised us these things, is faithful. He's never lied. Praise Yahweh. Praise Yahweh. And let's look at verse 12 also in Hebrews here. Chapter 12 and verse 12, because this is just as important Therefore, strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and follow the straight path that is made at your feet, so that the lame may not be turned out of the way, but rather be healed. We have to be equally concerned with each and every one of us. You know, if you see somebody struggling, don't take it as an opportunity to gang up and beat up on them. You know, don't be a bully with your attitude that way. Don't be, quick to jump on somebody who's having troubles. We all have troubles from time to time, and we need to consider that we are working together for this great cause, and it is Yahweh who prepared this work, not us. So we're not supposed to be condemning each other. We're supposed to be working together with each other. Praise Yahweh. And I know we could do it. I know we are doing it. And that gives me great joy and courage to see it done, because this is the work that will be talked about forever. And you can joyfully tell the future generations where you were during this time, that you were doing as you were supposed to, making ready for this kingdom. So at this time, if you all please stand, I do have the great honor and privilege to turn the services over to our next priest, the great priest in the House of Yahweh, the great Kohan, Shimon Hawkins.
Praise Yahweh. You can be seated. May the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you. I kind of would that the great Kohan didn't mention the feeble knees thing for the last scripture. What I'm going to be covering in this sermon is about the firmament, the global warming. If I can get what I got here. If you'll first be turning over to page 981, and this is the prophecy that speaks of Pastor. So this is Revelation 16 and verse 17. And it says, "And the seventh Moloch poured out his bowl into the air, and there came a great voice out of the house of heaven and from the throne, saying, 'It is done.'" Now, if you remember, Pastor brought this out, and the world is, just coming to the understanding of the serious predicament that they're in with the uncontrolled weather patterns and things like that. They called it global warming. It seemed to be the terminology that the world could grasp hold of, but it's kind of like this extreme weather patterns in the air. And it's also spoken of in Deuteronomy 28 and verse 22. This is page 170 of your scriptures. The scriptures talks about two forms of heat. We have the nuclear burning, and then we have the heat from the sun, which in Deuteronomy 28 and verse 22. It mentions both here. Deuteronomy 28 and verse 22. Yahweh will strike you, and we know this isn't Yahweh, but this is Yahweh pointed this out to what would take place to mankind. He spoke, and it came to pass, or it's coming to pass now. But this is the judgment. You'll be struck with consumption, with a fever, with inflammation, with scorching heat. And scorching heat, Pastor said, this is the heat that comes from the sun. And also you had the blasting heat, which is nuclear war. Okay, and then it mentions about the constant warring that takes place in the earth. With scorching heat, with the sword, with blasting, and with mildew, and they will stay with you until you perish. Okay, because mankind's going to bring that about for themselves. I wanted to bring attention to Psalms 122, and this is verse 3 and 7, and it talks about Jerusalem. And a lot of times kind of people were under the impression that that's where, we were going to go. And Pastor stressed that when this word was used, it mostly made reference to the people. But people get kind of caught up on words, and they really think that they understand it because they've researched it out. But you need someone, a teacher, the last day's witness, to point out what you need to understand about the Scripture so you can be prepared, you can have a part in this great work. So when in speaking of Jerusalem, this is Psalms. I don't have a page number. I didn't write it down. This is Psalms 122. And this is what I found this interesting in the studying of the global warming. I thought this was interesting that these things point out when you look into the prophetic word. Psalm 122, and this is verses 3, and I'm going to read 7. Also probably verse 8. But Psalms 122 and verse 3, it says, Jerusalem is built as a city which is compact together. Okay, now this stood out to me, the compact part, you know. And if you think about the human body, and I'm a little bit nervous on the subject only because, like, when you start getting into science, sometimes it's difficult to grasp, like, maybe all the terminology or everything that's used. But in going over speech number 3 in the speech class, it says, you know, any subject can be made interesting. So, like, if your eyes start to roll back in your head, then we can just repeat it. But it says, Jerusalem is built as a city which is compact together. In verse 7, it says, peace be within your walls, and blessings be with your palaces. Now, the word Jerusalem, number 3389, means founded and peaceful. It also comes from 352, strength, anything strong, specifically a chief, and it uses the word politically. We know that we're being trained for a government. Also a ram from his strength. I use the word pilaster, which I'm thinking is pillar, you know, but a strong support. An oak or a strong tree, and we know the pastor, you know, is the chosen branch. It also from word 7:999, Shalom. Now listen to this and think of this when it says Jerusalem is a city, which is describing the people, a city compact together. So think of unity, but also just think of this as your immune system or your body to be safe in mind, body, or estate. Figuratively to make completed, be friendly, uses the word amends, end or finish, and we know that this is this finishing work. Peace or peaceable, that is perfect, and to make restitution and to restore. You know, bringing us back to health when we listen to this pure golden oil and apply it within our lives. Now, within the prophetic word, now this is the second issue that came out, but on page 2, Pastor writes, this is the second paragraph, I believe it is. The cause of global warming is much more complex. That's like on page 1. I wrote it down in both places. But it says here, the cause of global warming is much more complex than anyone could ever imagine. Now listen to what Pastor writes. Like the body and brain, the firmament is a very complex, compact, constructed, individual working system. Now, when you think of Jerusalem as what the people, describing us as people, and we know that when we sing Pray for the Peace of Jerusalem, we know that it's Abelin. This is where, you know, Yeshua described it. It says, you've heard you're going to worship here and there, but I'll tell you it's going to be, in these last days, it's here, in the chief nation of all nations, here at Abel. But it says it's an individual working system. And on page 9, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to flip around quite a bit. But on page 9, here's what it says. It says, the Hebrew word describing firmament, we find the English meaning compact mass, proper and support. Now, this all connects in with this word Jerusalem, something solid, capable of bearing up waters. And I'm going to go a little bit into cell structure. So, and if you know that, like with cancer, unable to enter cells that have proper salt in it, and that's some of the things that you'll notice throughout the prophetic word. And here in 2 Samuel, like if you look at the great conquest, when he brought out building structure, because we as the people of Yahweh, we're here to guard. We're being trained so that we will guard and protect. So you'll never see the earth in the state that it is right now. But if you look at this in 2 Samuel 22 and verse 8, you don't have to turn there necessarily, I can read it. It says, "Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations of heaven moved and shook because he was wroth." That's the King James Version. But it's a reference to the firmament, okay, is actually shaken. Now these are firm foundations that Yahweh set when it's kept, in order. But this is what's taking place, is it's actually moving and shaking. Now, I have a Young's Compact Bible Dictionary. It's kind of like a paperback. But, wait, I want to turn to page 21 before I go there. Page 21. It's like I'm trying to build these layers for you so that when I go to the next part, it'll connect for you, because when it does, if you can get it to be interesting, this stuff is amazing. Now, page 21, it says, this is in description of viruses entering cells. Okay, now also the firmament, but, Yahweh's working with us, the world will catch up, but as long as we know it, we get sent out to teach them. When these viruses enter microcells in the bodies of men, women, children, and animals, they multiply. The same process occurs when these viruses enter the microcells of friendly bacteria, plant, soil, and even salt water. And that's the word, salt water there. Because they're dumping it in the ocean, You can protect your body even if the world isn't going to listen. We can protect our bodies and make sure that we're doing the proper things. But they dump blood, all the medical stuff, they just dump it into the ocean. They don't properly dispose of things. Now, in Young's Compact Bible Dictionary, I looked up wall, because I'm going to give you a brief description of walls and cells. Now, this is just a wall that you would see, like in this description, when everyone thinks it's speaking of a city, Jerusalem. This is a wall that would go around a city. Okay, if you looked up the word wall, it would say, fields and vineyards, houses and cities had walls made of sun-dried mud, brick, or stone. City walls were often massive and carefully built, since protection from attacks was one of their chief functions. Now, think of your immune system, because your immune system has cells and you have cell walls. Okay? The cell, now this is going to make a reference to page 2 of Global Warming and Prophetic Word when it talks about the firmament being compactly constructed. It says, the cell is the smallest structural unit of an organism that is capable of independent functioning. Okay, and remember on page 2 it said, like the body and brain, the firmament is a very complex, compact, constructed, individual working system. It's supposed to be able to function and do its job for mankind, and now it needs help, but it should be able to do it, but it does need help, and, the last day's witness is doing his job, and we're going to bring forth this help that it desperately needs. In it's like a verse, page 7 of the prophetic word. Now, this talks about the firmament. I thought I outlined it. Okay, yes. Talking about, in the King James, I believe it's translated expanse. It's expanse in the book of Yahweh. It was a pure, transparent expanse made up of micro-kingdoms that envelopes and governs the entire globe. And the word envelopes, if you think of when the scriptures talked about Yahweh stretched out the heavens, it was like a tent to dwell in. When they talk about cell structure, when they talk about the layer arrangements, they refer to them as envelopes. The envelope, and so it's the way that Yahweh made these things. When you read the scriptures, you would understand these things without needing to be ignorant like mankind and trying to prove everything, groping in the darkness. If you just looked at what Yahweh said, you would understand these things. But this is what they have. So it's referred to as envelopes. So I'm going to talk about two structures. Now, this is when mankind first started, when knowledge increased, and mankind first started to try to heal himself, okay? When they developed penicillin, now this was their gold mine for helping them. Okay, when they started to study these things out, they had two type of microorganisms. Well, actually, there's three that they later discovered, but they kind of separate these microkingdoms into categories as they understand them, and they'll refer to them as gram-positive, gram-negative, or gram-variable. And that's like when they're dealing with a culture, they'll try to stain it. And if it's a positive culture, it'll take up the stain. And they can see it. If it's a negative culture, it doesn't hold the stain very well. And then variables, you have different things with that. Now, the gram-positive cell, if I can do this, you see this? I drew this, but let's say the circle, the solid circle would be your center of your cell. Now, it has what's called the lines that are, the sweeping lines are referred to as sugar backbones. Okay, and then the green links would be peptide cross-links, and it's a very porous bacteria. This would be something like staph infection or staphylococcus. This is a major infection that takes place in wartime, and this is when they were developing penicillin. So this, when you dealt with penicillin, and they came up with a strain called penicillin G, it was able to attach to the enzymes that were around the center, and it was able to break, because penicillin is what is called a cell wall inhibitor. It does not allow the cell to rebuild its cell wall. So it ends up, the osmotic pressure, if I got that right, is the water that passes in and out of the cell, and the cell will burst. So what penicillin does is it breaks this structure down, and it prevents it from being able to reduplicate it, and the cell dies. So this is why penicillin was very successful in getting rid of these major like staph infections and things like that. It didn't work that well on gram-negative. Okay, gram-negative is somewhat similar. It has the same structure. It's not as thick. It's actually a little bit thinner. If you can see this, so it has the sugar backbones, and this is what gets broken down. Like when things decompose in the earth, they usually break down the sugars of these items. They're like children. Children like sweets. Now, the red ring is what's called a lipid membrane. Now, this is on the gram-negative, which is almost impermeable. Okay, it has they refer to that outer layer, the sugar backbones and the peptide cross-links, as peptidoglycan. Glycan is another word for sugar. It has a lipid-based membrane that's relatively impermeable. So that would be like E. coli, I believe, falls into that category. Actually, I have it here. Some of your gram-negatives would be like, this isn't a bacteria, but it's like a Coccobacilla, I believe it's referred to. Influenza, E. coli fall in that category. Pneumonia, that's why you don't, I'm guessing, I don't think you treat pneumonia with penicillin. Then you have meningitis and things like that, and your gram-positives would be like I said, staph and strep. Now, Alexander Fleming discovered this penicillin in 28. It had been done before that, but they gave him kind of the credit for it. Howard Florey's the one that is credited as turning it into this life-saving wonder drug. Okay, and this took place during the Second World War. They were trying to deal with these things. He worked in Peoria, Illinois. He was actually, I believe, in England, but he came to the United States in Peoria, Illinois. They did mass production of penicillin. Now, it was difficult to get it started, but eventually they did. They kind of like with the oil industries, the government goes to these independent companies, and they brought in Pfizer and Merck and all of that to try to find a way to mass produce penicillin. Okay, and they were able to do it. That was in 1941, by the way. The dates will be relevant. Now, if you look at, I don't know how much time I have to make sure that I get the main point of it, but Psalm 91 in verse 6, it refers to, this is how some of the, this is page 471. Uh, 471, now this is referring to this death that takes place, like it would take place in war and things like that. 91 in verse 6. Nor the pestilent that walks in darkness. And you can think of the shadow of death when you think of this. It's the most infectious thing that you're going to come across. Walks in darkness, nor of the destruction that wastes at noonday. And Pastor referenced that as this is like when they don't have time to bury the dead and these bodies decompose, and this took place time with the Crusades and things like that. Well, this is where your major mutations are going to take place because of the fact, and especially with the firmament breaking down, the way that they used to cause mutations with certain medical things that they dealt with is that hit it with X-ray radiation, which would mutate the genes, and that was kind of like not an efficient way, but it did what they wanted it to do to some degree. But now throughout history, the major killer in war is not the bomb and the gun and the knife. It's the fact that, I believe I read a statistic where if you have a certain percentage, let's say 100,000 people die, in a war, you're going to have double that die after the war from sickness and disease. Okay, that took place with the Rwandan genocide, the people that took place in this genocide, and then people just started dying afterwards because of all of the death that was there, all the death that just goes up into the air when a body isn't dealt with properly. Now, on January through May of 1942, okay, this is the first, I think, 5 months, 400 million units of pure penicillin were made, and this is they wanted it for the D-Day strike because they knew there were going to be a lot of casualties. By the end of the war, okay, so they had 4 million units in 5 months. By the end of the war, American pharmaceutical companies were producing 650 billion units a month. That's how much this was, their wonder drug. They were, I think it just showed how sick they were, But that was it. That was the situation that they were in. So you have this to take place. The reason why I wanted to show you some of this information, because I want to show you the brilliant wisdom that Yahweh has given Pastor. And, if the science wanted to listen, or if they wanted to prove it, they could. They really could, because I worked on this, and I was able to see and prove Pastor right. It's just, if they wanted to do it, they could. If they really wanted to help mankind, they would. Okay, 1998. This is a little bit of a change, but it's really how global warming became popular with the world. Okay, a graph or a study came out called MBH98. This is probably, I believe, Al Gore used it in his movie Inconvenient Truth. My apologies to Al Gore. I didn't see his movie, though, but he did use it. MBH98. The M stands for Michael E. Mann, is a climatologist and geophysicist from Penn State University. Raymond S. Bradley, a climatologist, a professor of geosciences from UMass Amherst. And Malcolm K. Hughes, who was a tree ring specialist from the University of Arizona. I believe he is also a climatologist. But what they did is they took tree rings, which is referred to as a proxy. A proxy is something that you would use to substitute or to show evidence of climate. You're going to look for climate. So this graph was a climate field reconstruction, and it was later termed the hockey stick graph, because what it did is it showed 1,400 years of of temperature. And what it did was it was relatively flat for the first period of time, and then it shot up. Around 1905, it started going up, and it looks like a hockey stick. So they call it the hockey stick graph. Now, there was a lot of, they debate back and forth because the stress of the graph says that it's warmer in this last time period. And they want to say that it was warm. There are certain scientists that say that in the medieval times it had an equally warm period. But this is what mankind has accepted. The graph became popular, and that's what mankind has grabbed onto. There's been some variations in the graph in 98 and then I believe in 2002, but the end of the graph stays relatively the same. It was put out the graph was prominently featured in 2001 in the IPCC third assessment report, which is IPCC is the International Panel on Climate Change. Okay, now these are the ones that go to speak before, world leaders and say we have a problem here. So this is what takes place. There were 4 other graphs, but they pretty much had the same idea. Okay, I'll give credit. One guy said, and on July 28th, a Republican by the name of Jin Einhoff said in a Senate speech and claimed that global warming is the greatest hoax ever perpetuated on the American people. They fight back and forth over the issue. But this graph stands. It's the reason why I brought out penicillin. Pastor said, write what's taking place in your life down because you're going to be witnesses of this. And one of the witnesses I know is that when Pastor worked at the State Board of Health Laboratory in Topeka, Kansas, Pastor asked the man there, are you sure penicillin works? Now, this man's speaking to the last day witness, so I think this is mankind's testimony, and he said, yes, penicillin works. So that is why I'm showing you what penicillin is. Mankind has agreed and said penicillin is their wonder drug. Okay, so that is why I pointed out to you. So this graph, they get all these things and they put them all together. They developed the Kyoto Protocol, which basically forced the United States they were going to, before it was voluntary if you wanted to limit your CO2 emissions. Now it's mandatory, or if you think it's mandatory. Now I'm going to show here, these are some of the graphs they come up with. I don't know if you can see them. Now, this is a CO2 graph, okay, of the past, it says from 78, I think is what it says. But in this lower graph, this is what would be referred to as the hockey stick, okay, and it goes from, this is 1880 up to 2000, okay. Now what they'll do is they'll have this graph, and so this is their temperature that they get, and they got upset at man because he's the one that's credited most with the graph, but they got upset at him because he said he blocked out the medieval war period, didn't want anyone to listen to it. He said, we got global warming here, let's do something about it, and everyone gets upset because they're talking about major changes that they have to make. So what they'll do is, to prove CO2 is the problem, they overlay the material to show you how similar they are. They say, if I can get something to copy this line, it is proof that that is the cause of the global warming. Well, this is the graph, the CO2 graph, okay? And what the people that don't agree with global warming, they actually did some benefit because they pointed this out. Those that don't believe in man-made global warming, what they kept on pointing out is this portion of the graph right here, where it dips. Now, this is your post-war economic boom where they're mass-producing everything and CO2 is being pumped into the atmosphere like you wouldn't believe. And they say, why did it get colder if CO2 is causing climate change? And that's why they won't believe them. And they said, you have nothing that points this out and shows anything having to do with CO2. So if you look at what pastors brought us for information, and if you look at sexually transmitted diseases and how they were on the rise, okay, if you think of this as sexually transmitted diseases, okay, so you got all this. This is television is invented around here this time, 1940, okay, and we know that that's the your swinging 60s and all that. So sin just exploded. But the graph dips. So, well, you're going to say, well, if sin explodes, then of course, why would the graft dip? You know, if STDs is causing this thing. So what you have here is a dip till about 1970 when it starts to rise again. Okay? So you have to account for that type of information. And the reason why I point this graph out to you is because everybody, when they're trying to convince large groups of people, always point to this graph because they think, well, you know, they're going to have their government policies and do what they want, but they need the American people behind them to do these things. So if you look at this information here, if I can lay this, okay, 1940 and 1970, what you have here, this is when they started mass producing penicillin, and they said it killed it. And Pastor said it drove it into the body and made it hide. Okay? And then you have it dip down. You know what took place by 1970? Bacteria became resistant to penicillin. I mean, it's clearly documented it took 30 years and bacteria developed the immunity to this, and penicillin is no longer effective on these major, you have MRSA with his methicillin-resistant staphylococcus. They're resisting this item. So what takes place is they instituted penicillin and drove it within the body, and it took 30 years, and that penicillin is no longer effective, and the temperature started to rise. I mean, that's the situation. If you look at it and you plug it in, it's 30 years that it's clearly documented the amount of time that it took for it to become resistant to these antibiotics. So if you listen to the last day's witness and what he teaches you, we might not have all the understanding right away, but if we apply this knowledge, Yahweh will use us to be able to teach this to others, and then everyone. You won't have to say, do you know Yahweh? Because everyone will know Yahweh. And with that, if you'll all please stand, it's a great honor to turn the services over to the great Khan Abel Hawkins.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. May the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one. It is truly, please be seated. It is truly a high honor and a great privilege to address the greatest family there is. The kings and queens, the kingdom of priests and the kingdom of priestesses here at the great house of Yahweh. Praise Yahweh for the great house of Yahweh. This beautiful day is the 9th day of the 7th moon, and as we are preparing ourselves to make atonement as the great priests of Yahweh instructed all of us, Yahweh's great house is a very beautiful work that is being unfolded here in these last generation. If you have I want everybody to look at this prophetic word here. You remember when the great prophet Jeremiah, when Yahweh spoke, when he worked in complete unity with Yahweh, Yahweh asked the great prophet Jeremiah, what do you see? And the great prophet Jeremiah said, I see an almond tree. My question to all of you, I really want everyone here, all over the globe, all over the world, here at the great house of Yahweh. I want everyone to take a close look on this prophetic word magazine here. I'm asking you to write down 3 things. What do you see? O house of Yahweh. What do you see? Write 3 things down concerning what you see. And that's the title of my sermon here this morning. Come, drink of the water of life. You know, when you look at Pastor's face, what we're looking at is the beautiful countenance, Yahweh's reputation and character within that anointed branch, the chosen branch of Yahweh. This one here, Yahweh chose and set apart this chosen branch, the chosen servant of Yahweh, the one sent, Yisrayl Hawkins. He is one of Yahweh's powerful, perfect reapers who will call to life the many nations who are buried underground. We're extremely blessed, but please write 3 things that comes to you. As Yahweh told Jeremiah, Jeremiah, what do you see? And I say to all the great house of Yahweh, what do you see when you see that? You see the light of the world. The great house of Yahweh is the light of the world. Yahweh, Yeshua, and Yisrayl Hawkins is synonymous. They work in sync. Yahweh is the conductor, and both Yeshua and Yisrayl Hawkins is in complete unity with Yahweh Himself. It's the inspiration and the leadership that flows from Yahweh to Yeshua and the chosen branch and to his seed. Remember what Pastor said. What a man chooses to practice changes his DNA in that direction. In this way, his genes are therefore transferred to his seed and his offspring. We are all the seed of Yisrayl Hawkins, the greatest teacher in the world, and that's what I see. I see the greatest teacher in the world, the seventh messenger, the seventh Malach of Yahweh. Pastor's sermon, as we study closely everything that he has written, this message of the great kingdom of Yahweh, the message that comes forth from the seventh messenger, the chosen servant of Yahweh, the one sent, Yisrayl Hawkins. His message is not a message of hatred, anger, retaliation, vengeance, or continual war. But it's under the leadership and the guidance and the direction of Almighty Yahweh and His Son Yeshua. So again, as we study closely the word of Yahweh, come to Yahweh's great house, come to Yahweh's eternal appointments, be ready and prepared to drink of the water of life that is being offered to you at the great house of Yahweh. Don't ever deprive yourself of the greatest opportunity that is being offered to each and every one of us here in the great house of Yahweh. If you have your books of Yahweh, I want everyone to go over to Psalms 119 and verse 130. Psalms 119 verse 130, and please pay close attention of the word of Yahweh. It's a well-acquainted scripture that is used continually in all the publications of the great house of Yahweh. But I really want to draw your attention, because this is what enlightens the called out ones of the great house of Yahweh. Through patience, persistence, and endurance, and practicing Yahweh's righteousness is what we are called here to do. But here in verse 130, I really want to fully bring to Yahweh's attention, this is a beautiful plan that is unfolding here. It reads, the unfolding of your laws. Remember, Yahweh's laws and prophecies is His beautiful reputation, His character that He offers to mankind. Yahweh sets before you His life and righteousness in front of us. It's Yahweh's life-giving instructions to all of mankind. But the unfolding of your laws, the very entrance of Yahweh's laws, the understanding of Yahweh's laws, the explanation and the declaration of Yahweh's laws, notice that, gives light. It gives light. The chosen servant of Yahweh, the one sent, Yisrayl Hawkins, he's the light of the world. He's the one, the gold and oil is poured out upon the chosen servant, the one sent, Yisrayl Hawkins. The gold and oil is the unified laws of light, the unified laws of righteousness and peace. The teachings that comes forth from the great house of Yahweh, the teachings that comes forth from the seventh messenger of Yahweh. He has taught us continually. He has continually taught each and every one of us how to live eternally, how to live forever, how to live righteously, peacefully, and in unity with Yahweh, Yeshua, the chosen servant of Yahweh, the one sent, Yisrayl Hawkins, with yourself, and everyone else. That's why the message that comes forth from the great house of Yahweh is not out of anger or vengeance or retaliation. The whole world is immersed in the cesspool, in the sewage of sin. Before we all came here to the great house of Yahweh, brethren, we were dead in our trespasses. We were dead in our sins. To be dead in your sins, to be dead in your trespasses, is the inability to bear righteous fruits, is the inability to bring forth life to others. And that's why the great house of Yahweh was established, to bring forth life. The unfolding, the very entrance, the introduction of Yahweh's plan brings light. Notice here, they give understanding to the simple. Go over to the side note, G15. Pay close attention, the simple. They give understanding to the simple. Remember that Yahweh is no respecter of persons, as one of Yahweh's great apostles was inspired to write. But whoever will reverence Yahweh by keeping his laws will be accepted by Yahweh. But notice in verse G15, even those who are unlearned or uneducated, when they submit themselves to Yahweh, have their eyes open and their minds, notice here, illuminated as soon as they begin to learn Yahweh's word, the law, and the prophets. You notice that? So again, we see here the everlasting love and mercy that Yahweh has upon mankind. Go over to Isaiah chapter 1. Isaiah chapter 1. We must continually keep in mind that when we come to every eternal appointment in front of Yahweh, the Sabbath, Yahweh's feast days, it's the mark of obedience. The mark of obedience is the strength of the called out ones here in the last days. But come to every Sabbath and every feast days prepared and ready to learn. Everyone in the world has the right to own a book of Yahweh. The book of Yahweh, it's back and it's here to stay. The house of Yahweh is back and it's here to stay. Yes, it will never be destroyed. Religious imposters. That's why Yahweh says, come out of that Herodian family. The family that called for the execution of Yachanan the Immerser, one of the great faithful messengers of Yahweh. Come out of it, because they continually to teach the people to stay in their misery, in their sickness. But here in Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 15, as on the 9th day of the 7th moon, leading up to the 10th day of the 7th moon. Before we came here, remember this, brethren, we were all unclean. We were sinful and defiled before Yahweh. And when we come to the great house of Yahweh, and when we sit at the feet of the greatest teacher in the world, and through his teachings will come forth many righteous, faithful, and trusted teachers, leaders, and instructors from the great house of Yahweh. But we were all unclean, sinful, and defiled before we came to the great house of Yahweh. We may be unlearned and uneducated, but when we come to the great house of Yahweh, it's the greatest opportunity that is being offered to each and every one of us. In Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 16, notice the word of Yahweh here very, very closely. Notice what it reads. Isaiah, the great prophet, Yahweh's great prophet. That's why pastor, the chosen servant of Yahweh, the one sent by Yahweh, he is one of Yahweh's powerful, perfect reapers who will call to life the many generations, those who are buried underground. That's the song that we're learning here. Purple belongs only to one royal family. And you study the word purple, is one of the most beautiful stones on the 12 stones of the breastplate of the high priest, the amethyst. But it's the 12th stone of all the 12 foundations there in Revelation chapter 21. We don't have time to cover that. Of all the 12 foundations, the purple stone is the highest. Is the very highest of all the stones. But notice what Yahweh calls. He pleads with all the inhabitants of the earth. Come out from this Herodian family. that brings forth continual destruction and misery. Notice here, but Yahweh says, wash yourselves. Wash yourselves. Get rid of all the filthiness, the uncleanness, the sinfulness, and all the defilement that we were immersed in. But wash yourselves. Clear your mind. Change your attitude. Change your eating habits. That's part of our overcoming and our conversion in the great house of Yahweh. We've come here to change, to overcome, and to be renewed in the spirit of our minds continually. But the word of Yahweh shows here, wash yourselves. Don't remain in your filth. Don't remain in your confusion, in your sickness. But Yahweh says, wash yourselves and make yourselves clean. See, Yahweh wants clean vessels of honor, sanctified and fit for the Father's use and prepared for every righteous work. And make yourselves clean. Put away the evil. Notice that. Put away the sin. Put away the sin. Put it away. Put away the uncleanness, the sinfulness, and the defilement. Put it away of your doings from before my eyes. And notice here, cease to do evil. Put a stop. We've been trained and we've been educated by the greatest teacher in the world. And all the many faithful, righteous, faithful, and trusted teachers in the great house of Yahweh. We've been sharpened with the word of Yahweh continually. But we are being trained and educated. And we are being inspired how to live eternally, how to live forever here in the great house of Yahweh. How to live righteously, peacefully, and in unity with Yahweh, Yeshua, the chosen servant of Yahweh, with yourself and everyone else. That's why I said, don't deprive yourself of the spiritual food that is flowing, the golden oil that flows out of the chosen servant of Yahweh, the one sent Yisrayl Hawkins. But cease to do evil. Put a stop. Stop the curses within your own family. Stop the consequences that comes with the breaking of Yahweh's laws. You can do it. We can do it. But notice in verse 17, learn to do righteousness, and that's the pattern. That's the foundation here of the great house of Yahweh. In Psalms 89 and verse 14, in Psalms 89 verse 14, we've got to just read these scriptures here off to the side and write it down for your notes. It says, justice and righteousness are the foundation of your throne. Loving kindness and truth goes before you. Yahweh, Yeshua, and Yisrayl Hawkins is synonymous. That's what Isaiah, the great prophet, saw. He saw justice as the justice as the measuring line, and righteousness the plummet. And that's the pattern of the kingdom. Yahweh, Yeshua, the chosen branch, the chosen servant of Yahweh, the one sent Yisrayl Hawkins and his seed. That's how the golden oil is being poured out here in the great house of Yahweh. But learn to do righteousness. Have a burning desire. Let it become your uppermost desire in your heart, in your mind, in your thoughts, to do righteousness. Seek the judgments of Yahweh. Relieve the oppressed. Yes, the whole world is filled with oppression. Again, this face here, come and drink the water of life freely. The chosen servant of Yahweh, the one sent Yisrayl Hawkins, is the most hated man on the face of the earth. He's been despised, he's been mocked. The house of Yahweh been ridiculed and snickered. But the teachings of the great house of Yahweh, from Yeshua and from all the prophets and the apostles, never to show vengeance, never to show retaliation. But again, learn to do righteousness, seek judgment, relieve the oppressed, judge the fatherless. Judge the fatherless. There's many fatherless children out in the world. They've been abandoned. But the house of Yahweh is offering and pleading with mankind, come to Yahweh's house, the great rock of Abel, and drink of the water of life. Yahweh's laws of righteousness and peace and unity. Plead for the widow. Plead for the widow. Notice that? Plead for the widow. In verse 18, come now. Come now. And let us reason together, says Yahweh. Come now. Don't hold grudges with your brothers. Come now and let us reason together, says Yahweh. Though your sins Though your sins be like scarlet, they will be as white as snow. Though they are red like crimson, they will be as wool. So you see the pattern of the kingdom. Come to Yahweh's house prepared to learn, to grow in the bond of unity, as the great priest of Yahweh was reading earlier. There in the book of Colossians 3, verse 15. And above all these things put on love, which is the bond of perfection. But in verse 19, if you be willing and obedient, and that's the attitude of servitude. Let this beautiful and glorious kingdom of Yahweh be in your mind, which was also in Yeshua Messiah. The scripture was read. Let this mind, this humble, submissive, and teachable mind, be within you, which was also in Yeshua Messiah. If you be willing and obedient, you will eat the fruits of the land. But if you refuse and rebel, you notice the choices that we must make. We have to eliminate all negative thinking. Before we think, before we speak, think. Is it the truth? Is it honest? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? Is it kind? Let the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable and pleasing before Yahweh. So always be on guard the things that we say and the things we do. Hold yourselves accountable, my dear brethren. Hold yourselves accountable for everything we think, we say, and do. Because everything that Yahweh does is of the highest quality of workmanship and service from start to finish. Yes, everything that Yahweh does is of the highest quality of workmanship and service from beginning to end, from start to finish. Yahweh don't take shortcuts. Close enough is not the pattern of the kingdom. I hear many carpenters. I got nothing against carpenters. You've done a great job. Look at our beautiful wall here. The wall of perfection. The wall of unity. People from all over the world, when you come here, you're going to rejoice. I shared with my family, when you get to the sanctuary, you're going to greatly rejoice. What do you mean? Can you tell me? You'll find out. Always be grateful and thankful and appreciative for being called to the great house of Yahweh. Always. I'm repeating Pastor's words. I have been prepared to bring forth righteousness. I cannot bring forth unrighteousness. This prophesied work is prophesied to bring forth righteousness. It is the greatest honor in the world to be called by the greatest being in the world. I've only asked for Yahweh's righteousness and to be called by His name. You, my dear brethren, men, women, and children, the kingdom of priests and priestesses of the great house of Yahweh, you are the righteous. We are the righteous, faithful, trusted teachers of the everlasting kingdom of Yahweh. We are the last acceptable offering that is being offered to Yahweh. Because everyone continually remains in the sewage of sin. Religious imposters, they continue to deceive the people. From Pope Francis and all the religions of the world, you have deceived the people. The Sabbath of Yahweh is a 7-day Sabbath. Yeshua was a teacher of Yahweh's Sabbath, a teacher of righteousness. Keeping our eternal appointments with Yahweh is the strength of character. So again, we see here, but if you refuse and rebel, you will be devoured. Notice here, you will be devoured by the sword. Yeshua said men's heart will fail them in this last nuclear generation. Men's heart, women's heart, the children's heart will faint, will fail them. Why? Because justice, righteousness are not taught to the people. The explanation, the unfolding, the declaration of Yahweh's laws, the daily reading and the explanation of the plan of Yahweh is not taught in the synagogues, nor in the churches. That's why Yahweh says, come out of that Herodian system, the Herodian family that has deceived the world for the last 2,000 years, or even from the days of Cain. All the world has gone the way of Cain. But if you refuse and rebel, and that's the attitude we've got to eliminate from our way of thinking. Don't be classified as stubborn and rebellious in disobedience to Yahweh. Come out from that attitude and choose Yahweh's righteousness. Remember that in verse 17. Learn to do righteousness. Seek judgment. Relieve the oppressed. Judge the fatherless. Plead for the widow. Put away the evil of your doings from before my eyes. Cease to do evil. We've got to crush sin. And don't play around with it. Because the environment and the surroundings that we are presently in, the surroundings and the environment that we're all presently in is a direct cause of the attitude of the growth of us. If we continue to latch on to the Yahweh's life-giving words here, the life-giving instructions, you will remain faithful and true and trusted as one of his great teachers. I want to cover here in the book of Jacob chapter 2. Again, I want to show the called out ones of the great house of Yahweh. Remember what Pastor said, a man's true character is measured by his obedience to the laws of Yahweh. In Jacob chapter 2, remember purple belongs only to one. Purple belongs only to one royal family, and that's the great house of Yahweh. And that's what we're qualifying for. In order to become one of Yahweh's powerful, perfect reapers, as Yisrayl Hawkins is prophesied to raise our forefathers very soon. I want to cover this beautiful law here in Jacob chapter 2, because Jacob was inspired to write concerning Leviticus 19 verse 18, do not seek revenge, nor bear a grudge against any of your own people, but you must love your neighbor, your brothers, as yourself. But in Jacob chapter 2 and verse 8, I want everyone to pay close attention here. And when you see that picture here, let's take that off for now. Notice the word of Yahweh. If you fulfill, notice here, the royal law, according to the scriptures, you must love the chosen servant of Yahweh, the one sent Yisrayl Hawkins as yourself. You do righteousness. You understand, my dear brethren? A lot of people, since being called to the great house of Yahweh, you see a lot of people hold on to anger, and it's a sting. It's a sting. People have grievance, anger, hatred for the chosen servant of Yahweh, the one sent Yisrayl Hawkins. But the law of Yahweh, the righteousness of Yahweh's laws are proclaimed here. If you fulfill the royal law according to the scriptures, you must love your neighbor. You must love the chosen servant of Yahweh, the one sent Yisrayl Hawkins, as yourself. You do righteousness. Remember what Pastor said, I am Yahweh to you. Now it's your duty to be Yahweh to me. And if you don't do it, finish it off. I'll lose you. That's what Pastor mentioned here in his presentation. So we see here the pattern of the kingdom of Yahweh. Yahweh is very merciful and compassionate. We've got a few more minutes here concerning his beautiful plan unfolding here. Turn over to Philippians chapter 3. Philippians chapter 3. I want to cover here concerning the great apostle who wrote the book of Philippians here. Remember, from the cradle to the grave, mankind has inherited nothing but lies. They've inherited nothing but lies because they've been taught deception. They continue to because of these religious imposters. What is a religious impostor? Read the recent Prophetic Word magazine. A religious impostor, a false prophet, a false teacher is one who is not a part of the prophesied work of Yahweh. That's a religious impostor. But here in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 13, I want to start off here in verse 13. Notice the word of Yahweh, what it reads. Brothers, I do not consider myself as having yet taken hold of it. But one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, and reaching forward to those things which are ahead. Don't make excuses. Don't justify your weaknesses. Cry out to Yahweh and beg Yahweh for His inspiration, His guidance, His direction every minute of the day. But that's what this great apostle was inspired to write here. But one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind. Don't hold grudges. Don't go back and visit your weaknesses in the past. Don't go back to the environment, the surroundings that we all came out of. Because that's the entrapment, the enticement of Satan herself. Forgetting those things which are behind, notice that, and reaching forward. In my native language, it's the word imua. Imua, I-M-U-A, imua. To forever go forward. To ever go forward in serving Yahweh. But forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forward to those things which are ahead. We're qualifying to be a part of Yahweh's everlasting kingdom of priests and priestesses in this everlasting kingdom. Reaching forward to those things which are ahead. And notice here, I press on. I press on. Repeat after me. I press on. I press on. Notice here. Toward the mark. The mark. For the prize of the highest calling. This is the highest calling. Yahweh called us to the highest mountain here upon the face of the earth. And I remember on the first day of the seventh moon, on the great Feast of Trumpets, when we were looking towards the west, and Yahweh allowed us, He allowed the seventh messenger to sight that new moon. Yahweh's faithful witness in the sky. But I remember Pastor said, you children, go up to the top. Go up to the top and blow the shofar. And those beautiful children, they follow those life-giving instructions. It's the most beautiful sound, the blowing. Blessed is the man who understands the sounding, the beautiful sound of the voice of the seventh Malach. Those beautiful children went up and they blew the shofar along with the priests of the great house of Yahweh. But I press on towards the mark of obedience, the mark of righteousness. Yahweh sets before each and every one of us His entire reputation. His character is without flaw. His laws are perfect. It's righteous. It converts the whole person. It rebuilds, it restores, and it renews the whole person from the inside out. The whole person. That's what it does if we would only humbly submit ourselves to Yahweh's everlasting righteousness. I press on towards the mark for the prize of the high calling of Yahweh in Yeshua Messiah. Therefore let us, notice here, let all of us, let us, as many as are righteous and perfect, righteous, faithful, trusted, and perfect, think in this way. Think in this way. Notice that across in verse 8. Think on these things. Philippians 4 verse 8. Therefore let us, as many as are righteous, faithful, trusted, and perfect, think in this way. Notice in chapter 4 verse 8, right off to the side. We've got to pay close attention to the every word of Yahweh. You know, when Pastor talked about that slump, when he bends down, he is Yahweh's official writer. It's where the called out ones, where we barely can keep up with everything that is being published here. The newsletters, the prophetic word magazine, it's the teachings that come from the great house of Yahweh is unmatched. It's second to none. Because we continually to cry aloud and spare not and lift up Yahweh's righteousness to this dying world. But finally, brothers, I'll conclude here. Finally, brothers and sisters, those who are qualifying to be a part of this everlasting priesthood, whatsoever things are true. Remember in Revelations 21 verse 5, Yahweh writes, the word of Yahweh are true and faithful. But whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest. Notice the attributes, the characteristics that Yahweh wants to place in our innermost parts. Our conversion, the rebuilding, the restoring, and the renewing of the inward parts starts with keeping our eternal appointments with Yahweh. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure. Remember, Yahweh is purifying the called out ones. That's what the purple means, the purification of the chosen servants of Yahweh, the chosen servants of Yisrayl Hawkins, the sons and daughters. But whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of righteous report. Don't ever spread a false report against any of your brothers or sisters. Learn to work together in the bond of unity. If you fulfill this royal law, as Yaakov said, if you fulfill the royal law according to the scriptures, you must love the chosen servant, the one sent, Yisrayl Hawkins, as yourself. You do righteousness. But if you love the chosen servant and you can't get along with your brother or your sister at work or wherever it may be, then we've got a spot there. You remember what Pastor brought out years ago? Their spot is not the spot of his children. It's a blemish. It's a defect that we've got to overcome. We have to get along and tolerate with each other. Learn to work together in the bond of unity and with everlasting peace and righteousness. And that's what the teachings of Yisrayl Hawkins is all about. He teaches us how to live eternally, how to live righteously, how to live peacefully and in unity with Yahweh, Yeshua, the chosen servant, the chosen branch, with yourself and with everyone else. And if there is any praise, notice that. If there is any virtue, and if there is any praise, notice that, the conclusion. Think on these things. Think law, as the great priest of Yahweh taught us many years ago. Think law. Let the laws of Yahweh forever come forth from your innermost being. Think law. Concentrate. Focus, focus, focus. Work, work, work here at the great house of Yahweh. Because Yahweh is very merciful. He's given us an allotted time to be a part of this beautiful kingdom of priests.